In 1893, the Anaconda copper mining company sealed one of the deepest vertical shafts ever constructed on American soil. They poured thousands of tons of concrete into the lower levels of their flagship mine in Butte, Montana, and the official explanation was structural instability, dangerous gas pockets, worker safety concerns. But here's the problem with that story. The shaft they sealed wasn't collapsing. It wasn't leaking gas. And the workers who'd been down there hadn't filed a single safety complaint in the months before the closure. What they had done, according to 3 separate foreman's journals that surfaced in a 1974 estate auction, was report something they couldn't explain. Smooth walls, perfectly geometric chambers, tunnels that predated every known mining operation in the region by what one geologist quietly estimated was several hundred years. The Anaconda lower shaft wasn't sealed to... I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Protect miners. It was sealed to protect a narrative. To understand what happened in Butte, you have to understand what Butte was before the copper barons arrived. The official history tells you it was empty land, wild Montana territory, a few prospectors panning for gold in the 1860s before the real money showed up. But the geological surveys from the 1870s tell a different story. Federal surveyors sent by the Department of the Interior recorded anomalies in their field notes that never made it into the final published reports. References to pre-existing excavation and quarried stone at depth. One surveyor named Thomas Hale wrote in his personal journal that the rock formations beneath the Butte Hill didn't match natural erosion patterns. He described right angles where there shouldn't be any, and boreholes that were too uniform to be animal burrows or water channels. Hale's journals ended up in a university archive in Missoula, largely ignored for a century. What makes them so remarkable isn't just the anomalies he described, it's how carefully he documented them. Hale included measurements, compass bearings, and rough sketches of the formations he couldn't explain. He wasn't a sensationalist, he was a government surveyor doing his job, and what he found genuinely disturbed him. His final field entry from the Butte region contains a line that's hard to forget. I do not believe these formations are natural, and I do not believe I am the first man of science to stand here. When a graduate student tried to reference those journals in a 1988 thesis on pre-Columbian mining activity, his advisor told him to pick a different topic. The student complied. The journals went back to collecting dust. Now, the Anaconda company didn't start small. Marcus Daly, the Irish immigrant who founded it, arrived in Butte in 1876 with backing from investors who already knew exactly what was down there. Not copper. Not yet. What Daly's earliest operations uncovered was a network of tunnels that extended far below the silver deposits everyone else was chasing. His crew didn't dig those tunnels, they found them. And according to a letter Daly wrote to his financial backer George Hurst, the tunnels contained evidence of prior industrial activity of a sophistication I cannot reconcile with any known history of this region. That letter was part of the Hurst family papers. It was catalogued in 1942 and then quietly removed from public access in 1957. No explanation was given. The index still lists it, but the physical document is marked as transferred with no destination recorded. What Daly's miners found in those lower tunnels changed the trajectory of the entire operation. Instead of following the copper veins outward, which is standard practice, Daly ordered his crews to dig down, deeper than any mine in Montana had ever gone, deeper than the copper deposits justified. His competitors thought he was insane. William Andrews Clark, his bitter rival in the so-called War of the Copper Kings, publicly mocked Daly's obsession with depth over breadth. But Daly kept going, and his investors kept funding it. By 1885, the Anaconda operation had reached levels that the engineering of the era could barely support. The timber framing required to shore up the lower shafts consumed entire forests. Ventilation was a constant crisis, and yet the miners who worked those depths reported something strange. The deeper they went, the less reinforcement the tunnels needed. The rock walls became smoother. The chambers they broke into were already partially excavated. Some had what workers described as a glassy finish on the stone, as if extreme heat had been applied and then cooled rapidly. A shift foreman named Patrick Brennan kept detailed records of the lower shaft operations between 1886 and 1891. His logbooks, which survived because his granddaughter donated them to the Butte Historical Society in 1969, contain dozens of entries that the official company records never acknowledged. Brennan describes chambers with vaulted ceilings at depths exceeding 2,000 feet. He mentions finding metal fixtures embedded in the rock that weren't made of any copper, iron, or alloy his blacksmiths could identify. On one occasion, his crew broke through into a passage that extended horizontally for what he estimated was half a mile, perfectly straight, with walls that showed no tool marks of any kind. Brennan's final entry before the shaft was sealed reads simply, "Company men arrived from New York, told to stop digging, no reason given." The timing of the sealing is where the official story falls apart completely. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. In 1892, Daly was locked in a political battle with Clark over which city would become Montana's state capital. He was spending enormous sums on the fight. His company was expanding operations across the state. And yet in the middle of this expansion, with copper demand surging and prices climbing, he ordered the most productive lower sections of his flagship mine permanently sealed with concrete. The cost was staggering. The concrete alone consumed resources that could have funded 6 months of normal mining operations, and the work was done at night by a specially hired crew brought in from out of state. Daly's regular miners weren't allowed anywhere near the lower shaft during the sealing. Several of them protested. At least 2 were fired for asking too many questions. The official company report from 1893 cited geological instability and noxious gas accumulation as the reason for the sealing. But the mine's own geological assessments from the previous year showed no instability. The gas monitoring logs, which were maintained daily, showed normal readings throughout 1892, and the miners who'd worked the lower levels had reported no safety concerns. What they had reported, in informal complaints to Brennan and other foremen, was that the deeper chambers were unsettling. Not dangerous, unsettling. Men talked about feeling watched, about hearing sounds that seemed to come from below the deepest tunnels they'd reached, about finding markings on the walls that looked deliberate but matched no language anyone recognized. Now, what does any of this have to do with the broader pattern of sealed underground sites across the American West? More than you'd think. Between 1880 and 1920, at least 14 major mining operations in Montana, Colorado, Nevada, and Arizona reported discovering pre-existing underground structures during their excavations. In every single case, the discoveries were either sealed, reclassified, or simply never mentioned in official reports. The pattern is consistent enough that a retired Bureau of Mines inspector named Harold Whitfield compiled a report on it in 1963. He called it Systematic Suppression of Subsurface Archaeological Evidence and submitted it to 3 different federal agencies. All 3 declined to investigate. Whitfield died in 1971, and his personal papers were purchased by a private collector whose identity has never been made public. The Anaconda lower shaft sits at the center of this pattern because of what happened after it was sealed. Within 5 years, Marcus Daly had sold controlling interest in the Anaconda company to Standard Oil through a series of intermediary transactions that were deliberately structured to obscure the actual buyer. Standard Oil, controlled by the Rockefeller family, had no obvious interest in copper mining. Their empire was built on petroleum. So why purchase a copper mine? The answer might lie in what Standard Oil did with the lower shaft. They didn't reopen it. They didn't even survey it. They posted armed security at the sealed entrance for the first 18 months after the acquisition, something that was never done at any of their petroleum holdings. What they did, according to property transfer records filed in Silverbow County, was reclassify the sealed sections as Federal Reserve mineral deposits and transfer administrative oversight to a newly created subdivision of the Department of the Interior that existed for exactly 3 years before being dissolved with no public record of its activities. The reclassification meant that no private entity could apply for exploration rights to the lower shaft. No university could request geological access. No journalist could file a Freedom of Information request about what was down there because the subdivision that held the records no longer existed. The files didn't transfer to any successor agency. They simply vanished. In 1977, an independent geologist named Margaret Chen obtained permission to conduct electromagnetic surveys of the ground above the sealed lower shaft. She wasn't looking for anything controversial. She was studying copper deposit patterns for a Department of Energy contract. But her readings showed anomalies that didn't match any known mineral formation. Large hollow spaces at extreme depth, metallic concentrations in patterns that suggested manufactured objects rather than natural ore deposits, and most striking, thermal signatures that indicated heat generation from a source she couldn't identify. Chen's preliminary report was submitted to the DOE in December 1977. Her contract was terminated in January 1978. The termination letter cited budget reallocations, but Chen later discovered that her specific project line had been fully funded through 1980. The money was there. The will to let her continue wasn't. When she attempted to publish her findings independently, her university's legal department informed her that her employment agreement prohibited publication of research conducted under federal contract. She spent the next decade fighting the restriction in court and lost. By the time the legal battle ended, her original data tapes had been requested by the DOE for archival purposes and never returned. Chen retired in 1991 and gave one interview to a small geological journal in which she said, "I've spent my career studying what's beneath our feet, and the one time I found something truly significant, I was told to forget I'd ever seen it." The site today sits beneath the Berkeley Pit, the massive open-pit mine that consumed most of Butte's original underground operations starting in 1955. The pit is now flooded with over 40 billion gallons of toxic water and classified as a Superfund cleanup site. The water is so acidic it killed an entire flock of snow geese that landed on it in 1995. Nobody is digging there. Nobody is allowed to dig there. The Environmental Protection Agency controls access, and their mandate is contamination cleanup, not archaeological exploration. And the concrete plug that Daly's men poured into the lower shaft in 1893 sits somewhere beneath that lake of acidic mining waste, as inaccessible as it was designed to be. But here's what makes this story more than a historical curiosity. The pattern didn't stop with mining. Throughout the 20th century, whenever subsurface construction projects across the American West encountered structures that didn't fit the accepted archaeological timeline, the response was always the same. Seal it, reclassify it, reassign the records to an agency that would conveniently cease to exist. The interstate highway system buried at least 3 documented sites in the 1950s. Dam construction along the Colorado River flooded 2 more. Military base construction in Nevada and New Mexico occurred directly above areas where miners had reported pre-existing tunnels decades earlier. The locations changed, the method changed, but the policy never did. The question isn't whether something was found in the Anaconda lower shaft. The foreman's journals, the geological surveys, the electromagnetic readings, the suppressed correspondence, and the company's own bizarre behavior all confirm that something was down there that didn't match the official story of an untouched wilderness waiting for American industry to arrive. The question is why, over the span of more than a century, every institution that encountered evidence of pre-existing subterranean infrastructure in America chose to seal it rather than study it. Why the response was always concrete instead of curiosity. Marcus Daly died in 1900, 7 years after sealing the shaft. He never publicly discussed what his miners found. George Hurst died in 1891, taking whatever he knew about Daly's letter with him. Patrick Brennan disappeared from Butte's records after 1893, no death certificate, no forwarding address, no trace. And the concrete sits exactly where they poured it, 130 years ago, holding whatever is beneath it in permanent, deliberate silence. If this is the kind of story that makes you want to dig deeper, figuratively speaking, my next video covers what highway construction crews found beneath Interstate 15 in southern Utah in 1962, and why the Department of Transportation rerouted the highway 3 miles east to avoid it. That one is on your screen right now.